Now to London, to our i24 News correspondent, Jonathan Sacerdoti there in London. Jonathan, thank you for joining us this morning. Just to connect you to the subject here in studio, we are talking about any kind of international pressure on Israel to intervene diplomatically, militarily, as Israel is, one will say, at sort of a fork in the road as what to do next. What are you hearing from the UK?
Well, so William Hague the other day did give a statement to update on what David Cameron had already said, and he said that he wanted to see international pressure on both sides so that they would come to some sort of ceasefire arrangement, but he was very short on details. He mentioned that he'd spoken to the Egyptian foreign minister and that he was going to speak to other foreign ministers in Vienna when he met with them so that they could work on some sort of international response. But as I said, he didn't give many details. Of course, now we're hearing these ideas that the international response could be somehow similar to that in Syria, whereby we would see a deal for Hamas to be disarmed by the international community, and that somehow that might comfort Israel into stopping its activities in the Gaza Strip now so that it would feel secure without the need for military action of its own. But we haven't heard anything specific from British politicians to that end just yet.
We have a question here in studio.
Do you think that there could be a formula, a win-win formula, whereby Hamas would get something it would not want to lose if it breaks the agreement or the understanding reached with Israel, such as opening the Rafah crossing?
It's hard to know because, of course, here and in Israel, we have this mantra that we don't talk to terrorists and that terrorism mustn't be rewarded. And yet, of course, everyone talks to terrorists when they really have to. And we saw that with the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange as a very good example that was played out on the world stage. It was a huge negotiation with terrorists, resulting in a huge win for terrorists as well as a huge win for Israel. And whether or not the British government has as tough an attitude as it might say it does with terrorists is also something that remains to be seen. Obviously, if Hamas agrees to an international deal whereby it is somehow demilitarized, the rockets are taken out of the equation, it will expect something in return, because no player negotiates in any kind of deal, whether they're terrorist or otherwise, without being able to show their constituents that they came away with something, that they won something that was hard fought. And in this case, it might be money so that the Palestinians can show that they're building a state in a more effective way. If it is money, will that money go to the unity government, to Fatah, to the PLO, or in fact directly to Hamas? Seems absolutely unthinkable that it would go directly to Hamas. But at the same time, you know, we've heard pressure from the right in the US for US money to stop going towards the Palestinian Authority and the unity government because of its unity deal with Hamas, and that hasn't happened yet. So some there are already arguing that US aid money is in fact going into the hands of terrorists.
Jonathan, also at the beginning, at the top of the hour, we did speak to Ambassador Taub, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, about the protests in the streets of London. As a London resident yourself, you've seen the protests throughout each campaign in the past decade, from Cast Lead to Pillar of Defense, and of course to the current campaign. Can you say anything different about the protests? Are they intensifying? Are they different? Or is it the same profile, would you say, of protesters?
Looking on it from outside the protests, I would say that it looks similar. Every time there's a military action involving Israel, these protesters do come out onto the streets, and they are the same sorts of people, the same sorts of organizations, which is not to say that we can ignore them and we can totally negate their importance, but it does mean that this isn't necessarily a disinterested crowd who are taking a balanced view. These are people with very strong, passionate political feelings who come out onto the street, often at other military interventions that Britain has been involved in, people like the Stop the War coalition. But then you see other groups like War on Want involved in these kinds of protests. They're meant to be a charity for needy people. Now, occasionally they get involved, they say, with issues relating to Gaza because they feel that the military actions in Gaza create a situation of want for those people. But many argue that more often than not, they're actually taking part in anti-Israel activity relatively regularly, even when it doesn't fall into the remit of their charity. So these sorts of politically motivated groups often have quite an anti-Israel agenda, and they do mobilize quite effectively onto the streets. And what we saw just now in Paris, not too far from the UK, is terrifying to the Jewish communities here, and should be terrifying to the entire community, to all citizens, to see that people can be barricaded into a synagogue by a marauding crowd who are assaulting the synagogue, who have trapped those people inside the synagogue. And then it's not something that's unthinkable here. Back in 2009, during previous military engagement of Israel in the Gaza Strip, we saw a firebombing of a synagogue literally 5 minutes from where I'm sitting now in northwest London. We saw, thankfully, there weren't people inside, and the firebombing was unsuccessful. The doors were burnt. I believe petrol and rags were poured through the door's letterbox. And when we see things like that taking place, there is no question that the British government needs to be careful about how it talks about Israel and about how it talks about the actions there. Because if it's serious, as it says it is, about supporting Israel's right to defense from these terrorist rockets, it needs to make sure that that reflects into society, so that this hideous rise of anti-Semitism that's being experienced by Jews across Europe shouldn't be something that people live in fear of.
Thank you very much, I24 News correspondent Jonathan Sacerdoti there in London. Of course, you are updating us throughout this week of Operation Protective Edge.